Hi, I'm going to talk to you all about two of the chapters in the South Africa book, History of South Africa book, the chapters dealing with apartheid era South Africa, and also the chapter dealing with segregation era South Africa, the period before apartheid. Now, a lot of you all I'm sure you all have heard of apartheid before, and of course you all have heard of segregation before. And you all may have a hard time understanding, what's the difference between apartheid and segregation? Segregation and apartheid both believe in keeping different racial groups apart from each other. And apartheid, in English literally means apartness. And so how are they different? Well, segregation, as practiced in South Africa and also as practiced in the United States and a number of other countries that had segregation, meant that in terms of political power and opportunities and amenities, people who were considered to be of different races did not have the same opportunities, did not have access to the same things. And that although segregation, like for instance in America with Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court said things should be separate but equal. In reality, I don't know of any segregation system that truly had separate but equal amenities. In reality, the dominant group always had better amenities, always had better opportunity, always had better access. That's just the reality. If you truly have separate but equal, you have two independent people. You have one country or one territory, and you have another country and another territory. If one group dominates the other group, then inevitably the group dominating is going to have superior access and superior amenities. And that's what you have in segregation. Now, I posted the video of the lecture I did on the development of mining in South Africa. And mining in South Africa became a major industry in the 19th century, beginning with diamonds in 1867 and gold in 1886. By the time you get to 1910, South Africa is a unified dominion. The British the English-speaking whites and the Afrikaans speaking whites. And in Afrikaans, now sometimes you hear people talk about Dutch. Afrikaans is essentially a pidgin form of Dutch. The Afrikaans language has fewer verb tenses than you have in Dutch. And in a lot of ways, it's a more simplified language. And that's because, like most pidgin languages, it developed through conversation, through communication between Dutch speakers, the people who originally came to South Africa from Europe, and the people who were their servants or slaves. And over time, this language, this pidgin form of Dutch, became adopted as the language. Essentially, Afrikaners from the end of the 19th century onward saw this language as a part of their national identity. And they accepted Afrikaans as their language. So that's why you hear Afrikaans and you hear English. Those are the two languages spoken by the two white groups. Well, anyway, to get back to what I was talking about earlier, by 1910, South Africa has become a unitary dominion of the British Empire. And by the early 20th century, it essentially becomes independent. In much the way Canada and New Zealand and Australia became independent. Now, in the early part of the 20th century, South Africa proportionally has its largest white population ever. Basically from about 1910 to about 1948, whites are a little bit over 20% of the population, which is a pretty large minority. For instance, if you kind of put things in inverse order, if you look at the state of North Carolina, for instance, it's about 20% black. And so you could imagine, inverting that. Whites were a definite minority, but they were a big minority. 1 out of 5 people is pretty significant. And because the white population was pretty large and diverse, the Afrikaners were descendants of Dutch-speaking farmers who had been there for several hundred years. The British started coming in the 19th century. And by and large, the British were much better connected in the business and had more money. But you had a very diverse population. You had working class whites, you had farmers, you had business people. And so this large minority was diverse and had a lot of different interests. And if you've read the book, you saw that white workers in particular, really saw Africans as competition and wanted to suppress their wages and limit their opportunities so they could improve themselves. And so, really, from the beginning in the 20th century, you have a contradictory thing going on in South Africa. You have a situation where whites have taken over the country, blacks have lost their independence. The white minority wants to control the black population, but at the same time, there's always this fear of integrating the black population too thoroughly into the modern economic sector. Because since blacks are a large majority, and since traditionally they had not made the same amount of money, they were very, very powerful competition for the white minority. And so there was always this effort of how do you control black workers? Now, during the segregation period, you had a situation where, from the very beginning in the 20th century, Afrikaners, were dominant in politics because they were the majority white population. About 55% of all whites were Afrikaners. People of British background were in the 40s. They were about 10 points smaller minority. However, English-speaking whites tended to be much more well-to-do. And so there was always the issue of, for politicians, who the leaders tended to be Afrikaners because they were the largest portion of the population, but still they could not ignore the interest of the more well-to-do English-speaking portion of the population. And also the English-speaking portion of the population, they were the people from the British Empire, and the British Empire had conquered South Africa and incorporated into its empire, so they couldn't really ignore them. However, they had to find ways to satisfy the Afrikaner majority. And so during the segregation era, black opportunities are limited, blacks are segregated. However, blacks are still part of the country. Black South Africans, their education is still part of the country, although the government at that time doesn't really pay for it. However, beginning with the Native Land Act of 1913, the government goes through the process of alienating Africans from the land, reducing their access to the land, and pretty much forcing all blacks to be laborers. Blacks were not allowed to own land because that would be competition for white farmers. But at the same time, they also were not really allowed to get completely into the economy as workers. And so really, this comes up with a fundamental contradiction of both the segregation and apartheid eras. You have a country with a huge black majority. These people are not going to disappear. You have a white minority. And the white minority wants to be dominant. They want to have the economic plums of the economy. However, what do you do about a large majority? A majority that's growing, and also a majority that understood the Western economy. One of the great falsehoods of segregation and later apartheid South Africa was this notion that Africans had this tribal society. And I use the word tribal in quotes. I mean, for those of y'all, if you read your test, you know that I really don't like the term tribal, because the term tribal is a colonial term. It's a term that's used to lessen the importance of non-Western people. People in South Africa, the indigenous people, the Zulu, the Xhosa, the Sotho people, Venda, all these people are nationalities. These people were separate nationalities who had their own government systems and who ruled themselves before they became incorporated into what became the Republic of South Africa. They were separate nationalities. they had separate languages. A lot of times you'll hear people talk about African dialects. No, they're different languages. Now, most of the languages are part of the Bantu family of languages. They're related. But then, if you look at Europe, I mean, English, German, Dutch, Swedish, Norwegian, these are all related languages. I mean, they're all Germanic languages, but they're not the same language. I mean, in the case of a language like English, where about 50% of the vocabulary is of Latin origin, you actually have relatively few cognates between the English language and the German language. And when I say relatively few, of course, there are thousands of them, but there are also many, many cognates between, say, French and English, or between Latin and English, because so much Latin influence came into English after the 11th century. Now, I'm getting way off the point, but the point I'm trying to make is that, Africans were separate national identities in the period before they were defeated. But however, once they were defeated and brought into the colonial and then eventually the independent system of South Africa, they became integrated into the country. They became urban people. And what we see over the passing of the 20th century is that African populations, to a large degree, became not homogenous, but they developed urban identities. I mean, people still, if you were a Zulu speaker, you still had your Zulu language, but people developed languages that they spoke to people from different groups. And they also learned each other's languages. Now, that's one of the things that if you go to modern day South Africa, most Black South Africans speak about 10 languages. They'll speak all of the major Black languages. They'll speak English and they'll speak Afrikaans. And so therefore, the Black population, as a result of being incorporated into the British Empire, they very quickly adapted. For those of y'all who listen to the lecture I've given about, I posted about the mining industry, they very quickly understood that, since mining was a new game in town, they could make money there. And they could use that money to develop their communities. But what we see in the 20th century is that with the passage of the Land Act, they lost access to the land. And so what this meant logically is that far more Africans moved into the cities. Now, the problem is that many whites, especially Afrikaners, were moving into the cities because although throughout the 20th century, the government put a lot of money into agriculture and Afrikaans-speaking farmers became quite rich, it's like big farming everywhere. I mean, one of the aspects of modern farming is that with mechanization, you just simply have a need for fewer farmers. And so inevitably, more Afrikaans-speaking farmers find themselves being urban people, going to the city and getting jobs in the city. Now, the thing that really brings this to a head is World War II. Once you get into World War II and South Africa ends up on the side of the British. Now, of course, that you had a significant portion of Afrikaners because, really from the 1930s onwards, Afrikaner nationalism and what eventually becomes the National Party becomes stronger and stronger and stronger. And you have a significant portion of them who become part of the Asa van Bradwig, this organization, that, is essentially Nazi supporters and that engaged in some acts of sabotage against South Africa in support of the National Socialists in Germany. But by and large, the South African political leadership realized that going against Britain, it just didn't make sense. It was unlikely to work out well on the part of Afrikaners, even though there was that strong resentment of Britain. And so what we see is that during World War II, South Africa becomes militarily involved in World War II. About a quarter million South African men fight in World War II. And also, the industrial capacity of South Africa greatly increases. Now, what this means is that the number of blacks coming into the cities greatly increases. Now, one of the things that happens in the 20th, that developed in the 20th century, well, what was known as influx control. The idea that the government had a system of passes, and the basic idea that people who weren't white needed to have some kind of pass, saying that they had permission from white people in authority to be in white territory. That goes back really as far back as the 17th century. But what we see is that during the 19th century, that process becomes much more formalized. And you have a police system that develops to put people in jail if they don't have their passes. Africans have to have passes in order to come to the city. They have to have passes in order to get jobs. But during World War II, because there is such a demand for work, for people to work the jobs in order for the war effort, pass laws are relaxed and black populations rapidly increase. All of the major cities, even Cape Town, which is in the Western Cape, which traditionally was a part of South Africa where people who are quote unquote considered black South Africans, those people who largely speak languages from the Bantu family of languages. Now, you always had to be careful about that term in South Africa because many black South Africans consider the term Bantu pejorative. And I'm not calling people Bantu, but I'm saying that, but it's just the fact that from the linguistic standpoint, the Bantu family of languages is the dominant group of languages in Africa from about Congo on down to the tip of Africa and going into East Africa also, that the majority of people in the central and southern part of Africa speak languages that belong to the Bantu family of languages. And so the people from the eastern part of South Africa traditionally were not really a major presence in Cape Town. But to get back to the point I want to make, all of the major cities, if you're talking Cape Town, Port Elizabeth, Durban, Pretoria, Johannesburg, Kimberley, all of these cities ended up with very, very large black populations who worked either in the mines or factories or who had jobs in the cities because that's where the jobs were. And, interestingly enough, South Africa in particular was always the South African government, the segregation and the segregated government and the apartheid government was always really concerned about black women. They really wanted to control the number of black women who went into the cities. They wanted to keep black women out on in the homelands. And, they only wanted men to come to the cities and work and then go home. But what we see is that the number of women and the number of men coming into cities increases during this period. And what we also see, too, is that political activism among black South Africans increases. The African National Congress, which is first formed in 1912, for about the first 20 or so years, is a very ineffective political organization. And this is largely because black military struggle had been thoroughly defeated in the 19th century. And blacks knew that militarily they did not have the wherewithal to fight whites. But they did understand that the British in particular talked about constitutional government, they talked about the law, and they talked about rights. And so what we see is that the African National Congress wrote a lot of petitions, they wrote a lot of letters, they contacted people in authority in order to try to make sure that their rights were respected and that the interest of the black majority would get some sort of redress by the government of South Africa. I mean, in real terms, they weren't even looking for equality. They were just simply looking to not be completely ignored or completely run over. But what we see, especially in the 1940s, is that with more black people moving to the cities, and especially with the leadership, initially with Dr. Alfred Uma, and then later with the Youth League of the African National Congress. Uh, African National Congress leadership becomes more aggressive and becomes more demanding, and becomes harder to ignore. And what we see in particular is that when the war ends, you know, the Afrikaner leader Jan Smuts, who he had a long career going all the way back to the South African War in from 1898 to 1901. He becomes very much an international leader. He had been part of the organization of the League of Nations, and also helped participate in the foundation of the United Nations. One of the major things that happens in the pre-apartheid period is that the African National Congress under Alfred Bikuma goes before the United Nations and publicly condemns South Africa for its history of discrimination, and is able to keep South Africa from incorporating Southwest Africa, which nowadays is a separate nation of Namibia, as part of that country, which was a major humiliation for Jan Smuts, to have these black people that he considered his inferiors to win a debate before the world and deny South Africa of what he felt it should have. And so it's not surprising that, with this huge increase of black people moving to the cities, and with the defeat of the United Party in world politics at the United Nations, it's not surprising that in 1948, the National Party, which had been rebuilding itself going back to the 1930s, really going back to 1938 or so, that it emerges as the winner of the 1948 elections. And once they win, they develop the policy known as apartheid. Now, apartheid, as I said before, it incorporated segregation. But apartheid was really an attempt to try to create an ideology that would give some sort of legitimacy to majority white government. In other words, what we see is that with apartheid, all the different, racial categories, to use the term, were broken up into different groups. The two major white populations, English speakers and Afrikaans speakers, they were considered the whites. Now, if you put those two groups together, they're 21% of the population. They were if you include both whites, they become the largest single part of the community. But if you break up all of the 10 or so major, initially about 8 major black groups, eventually 10 were mentioned. If you break them all up into little groups, then you can argue that, whites are actually the majority. All the different little black, the Zulu here, the Venda here, the Sutu here, the Xhosa here, all these all these different people, they're really minorities. Whites are the real majority, and all these black minorities, they have their homelands. We're not denying them anything. They have their homelands. Now, what apartheid would argue is that we allow these foreign minorities to come into our country and work, but they have their own homelands that they should control, and eventually apartheid argues that these homelands should become independent. Now, in real terms, this independence was a joke independence, because these homelands were tiny, they had no resources, and there was no way on earth that they could actually support their populations. But by claiming these people were their own people and they had their own territories, it was a sort of a fig leaf that could kind of sort of cover the naked racism of apartheid. And so what we see during the 1950s, under the leadership of Dr. Vervoet, who's mentioned extensively in the book, is that, we have a proliferation of laws and policies. Like, for instance, you see the Immorality Act, Prohibition of Marriage Act, the Population Act, because actually, up until 1950, so it had never been against the law to have relations or to marry outside of racial lines. But once apartheid, and what you see is, especially among Afrikaans people, many families were composed of people who might be considered white and also people who might be considered colored. But once you have apartheid and you have laws that require the registration of populations, it literally broke up families because there were situations where they literally had like a paper bag or some other kind of brown thing, and if you were darker than that, you were colored. If you were lighter, you were white. They would put combs in people's hair. If you had my kind of hair or hair that was kind of kinky like mine, if the comb got stuck in your hair, you were colored. If the comb would fall through your hair, then you were white. And so this would literally break up families. And then you had laws like, for instance, laws against communism. But, communism was defined so broadly that, anybody and their mama could be called a communist. And so all throughout the 1950s, you see this really vigorous application of these laws in order to shut down urban black populations and to really kind of relegate black people outside of positions of authority. And what we see is that, if you look in your book, it talks about the Rivonia Trials. It talks about campaigns for people to not carry their passes. A lot of people, thousands of people went to jail because they refused to carry their passes. You had people, even before apartheid, refusing to catch buses. Black people really protested. I mean, like, for instance, the generation of Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, the people who would become leaders of the African National Congress, once South Africa becomes a non-racial democracy. These were young men at this time, and they were actively fighting against apartheid. You also had a number of whites, especially people who were liberals, and also people who were members of the Communist Party, who fought against apartheid too. Because South Africa is kind of different from the United States in that, like in a lot of parts of Europe, you had former communist parties that were part of the government. South Africa had one too. As a matter of fact, it's kind of funny because, if you look at the chapter on segregation, they talk about workers, white workers who were fighting for their rights. They actually had workers who said, workers of the world unite and fight for a white South Africa. They basically took the communist logo, but they used it for segregation. What we see, however, in the 1950s is that, and also probably the most famous of the white communist leaders, a fellow who had also become a major member of the ANC and also a member of the ANC's military wing, Mkhonto we Sizwe, is Joe Slovo. So, Joe Slovo, along with Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, Walter Sisulu, and a number of other people, these were folks who were like major leaders in the fight against apartheid. And so what we see is that throughout the 1950s and going into the 1960s, they really fight hard. But we see that South Africa has the resources, the South African government has the resources, even though as you get into the 1950s, it's clear that the old colonial aspect of Africa is dying. Outside of South Africa, initially you see countries like Sudan and then Ghana, but by the 1960s, there is a huge rush of black countries that become independent of the British, of the French, and, Spanish, and, eventually as you get into the 1970s, Portuguese, these countries become independent. And so it's obvious that the days of white rule are really limited. And eventually get to the situation where, white rule really holds on to South Africa, in Rhodesia, and we know what nowadays is Zimbabwe, and also in the Portuguese territories of Mozambique and Angola and Guinea-Bissau. And like I said, the South African apartheid government is powerful enough that eventually by the 1960s, all of the African movements for independence, the African National Congress and also the Pan-Africanist Congress, these folks, are largely put in jail. A lot of them have died. A lot of them go into exile. But, and this is a really big thing here, the basic demographic conundrum of white South Africa, the fact that you have this large black majority that is continually pushing for jobs, that just gets worse because as the 20th century goes on, the overall percentage of white people in the general population declines. As I said before, in 1948, from about 1910 to about 1948, whites are about 21% of the population. But what we see is that by 1970, 1976, whites drop down to about 12% of the population. And the black presence keeps growing. And so what this means is that even though the government fights against it, even though people in business don't really want to do it, they have to hire more black people to work in business. They have to give more black people skilled jobs. And you have to have more black people in the cities. And so you have the situation where at one level, the government is trying to hold on to white power, trying to hold on to an especially privileged position for people who are white. But at the same time, they cannot avoid improving the situation of black workers because it's just pure economic necessity. And as you have more people in the cities, as you have more people pushing for work, what we see beginning in the 1970s, and we're going to see this continue into the 1980s and 1990s, is that apartheid government is in a situation where it really becomes untenable. And so the thing I want you to think about with the segregation and the apartheid era is that from the very beginning, there was a fundamental contradiction of defeating this huge majority, trying to control them, but at the same time needing them for the economy. And as time progressed, this weakness only got worse over time and would eventually be the catalyst that would undermine racially discriminatory government in South Africa. Well, I hope that's helpful to you.